Before we start this evening, it's inappropriate to have the 26th annual popcorn forum without popcorn, so it's in the back and you can help yourself. And I'm going to introduce our moderator for this evening. First of all, we are just so excited about this week. We had a wonderful day. We had over 1,000 people at the beginning of the first program today. And I have been talking with the panel members, and you're in for a lively evening. We have some real professional moderators at North Idaho College, and one of those is appearing this evening. It is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and he also is a permanent, regular panel member of the North Idaho College TV Public Forum. And he and I have already taken 4 television programs for you that was extremely exciting. And Steve, thank you so much for being today's moderator. Steve Schenck.
Tony, it's a pleasure, and I want to welcome all of you to this evening's presentation. We're about to enter into a dialogue with some of the world's great men. There are no women on my panel, unfortunately, but you'll have a chance. I hope you will come back. You'll have a chance to visit with some of the world's great women in subsequent response panels. I'm going to take just a couple of seconds to explain to you what we're going to do this evening, and then I will be introducing our distinguished group of panelists. We will be asking each of our great historic figures to spend about 10 minutes with you and to introduce themselves and talk about their lives in the period of time in which they lived. That should not take more than 50 minutes in total, and that will give us approximately 40 minutes, because this will not last more than an hour and a half, I promise you that. That will give us approximately 40 minutes for your questions and answers, which is frankly the part of the program this evening that I look forward to the most, and I think our panelists do too. After I introduce our panelists, and I will introduce them as they are in real life and as their historic incarnations, once they're introduced, though, as their historic characters, they will be in character. They'll stay in that character for the rest of the evening. I'm going to begin with Chris Stein. Chris is on the far left. He's the president of the Associated Students of North Idaho College, and he will be portraying John Adams, the second president of the United States. Next to him is Harvey Richmond, and I'm going to describe Harvey in his own terms as a part-time rancher, a part-time attorney, and a full-time notary public. He's going to be portraying Alexander Hamilton this evening. On my far right is Jeff Jeske, who will portray John Marshall, who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1800 to 1835. Jeff is an NIC student, and he's been with us so long, I think he took his first semester here about the time Chief Justice Marshall ended his term. He's now co-enrolled at Gonzaga University and hopes to study law there. Next to him is Scott Reed, a very well-known attorney and champion of environmental issues in our area, and he will be portraying James Madison, the 4th President of the United States. And finally, in the position of honor, it is a real pleasure for me, and I know it's going to be a pleasure for you, because I've had the opportunity to see the President, Mr. Jefferson, twice today, and he is absolutely outstanding. I'm going to give you just a little bit of his resume. I can't do justice to it in the time we have, but he is a Rhodes Scholar, one of the founders of the modern Chautauqua movement, recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Charles Frankel Prize, which, by the way, he received from President George Bush, and currently a distinguished professor at the University of Nevada at Reno. And again, he will be portraying Thomas Jefferson. And I think I will give him a moment, since a number of the other panelists that you'll be hearing from this evening are well-known antagonists of the President, to let you know just a little bit about how he feels being here this evening. Mr. President?
Well, my dear citizens, let me thank you for coming, and let me say from the beginning that I am a man of harmony. I shrank from conflict all of my life. In fact, whenever there was controversy of any sort, I either disappeared or got a migraine headache. And I feel one coming on at this moment. As an exemplar of the Enlightenment, I believe very strongly in this principle, that if we have a free marketplace of ideas, in the long run, truth will drive out error, good sense will drive out superstition, and justice will drive out vice. My only hope is that you will listen to tonight with an open mind, And when we have finished, I trust you to realize where the justice of the argument lies. Thank you.
For those of you who just came in, that was Dr. Clay Jenkinson, who will be portraying Thomas Jefferson this evening. The rest of our panelists will be introducing themselves at length in their historic incarnations, and I believe we will start with Chris Stein as John Adams.
Well, my now good friend Thomas Jefferson says that he shrinks from adversity and conflict in order to preserve the harmony. However, it is people and nations are forged in the fires of adversity. It is adversity that's what makes us strong as a people and as a nation. And that is why I am one of the greatest presidents of the United States. I was born in 1735 in the town of Braintree, Massachusetts, to a long line of Adamses who had lived there since the early 1600s. When I chose to marry my wife, Abigail Smith, there were many detractors to the marriage, saying that I was lowborn, that I was worthless. Fortunately, my dearest father-in-law stuck up for me, and in an actual sermon, he spoke. And John came, neither eating nor drinking, and ye say he hath the devil. He quenched a lot of the detraction that occurred and allowed me to marry my dearest Abigail. And through that, we had many children. The one of whom I'm most proud of is John Quincy, who in 1825 became the 6th President of the United States. One of the proudest days in my life that I had for my son. Fortunately, he did not have to deal with many of the things that I had to during my presidency. My term lasted but a single one, as opposed to George Washington and my now longtime friend, Thomas Jefferson. And that was because of the adversity that occurred. But it was the adversity that occurred during my term that made this nation stronger. I fought against my own party to prevent a war with France. I fought against the Republicans to maintain a nation. And fortunately, through it all, there was my wife. I have been described as a vain man. I have been described as a strong man. But my wife was really my strength. When I was overseas, she would send me letters describing what she had done, and I knew that as long as she was there, I could withstand all of it and more. She was a very, very great woman. As she was recovering from an illness one time, there was a pestilence that struck the town, and she turned our home into a hospital and cared for those that were stricken. I owe all of who I am and what I am to my wife. I'm sorry, I become distraught when I think of her. It's been over 200 years, you know. This is a great nation. And as many of you know, I myself had a hand in forging that nation. I was an ambassador to France. I was on the First Continental Congress. I assisted Thomas Jefferson with the Declaration of Independence. It is a great document. And maybe it could have stood on its own and been ratified and passed. But I think it was due largely in part to my adversarial nature that allowed the Declaration of Independence to become what it is and stand for what it did, and allowed us to create this great nation. On the 50th anniversary of that document, I died. July 4th, 1826. My last words that I spoke were, "Thomas Jefferson yet survives." However, as he had done several times in the past, he proved me wrong again. He had died several hours earlier. Thank you.
We'll hear next from Harvey Richmond is Alexander Hamilton.
Mr. President, by your leave, gentlemen, ladies, Alexander Hamilton is known to all of you, and I want you to know me well. I think it is important to remember that in the beginning of our country, there were times where we had disagreements between some of the gentlemen who you see before you. It is also important for you to know that I was born outside of the United States in the town of Nevis in the Caribbean. I therefore had no great loyalties to any particular state, and that made it so much better for me when I adopted the philosophy that I did, and I will share that with you. It is also important for me to remind you that my parents never married. Mr. Madison may remind you of that later tonight. Notwithstanding, I believe that the philosophy that I undertook began when I worked as the right hand of General Washington. I was his aide-de-camp in the Revolutionary War, a war against Great Britain. But there came a time when I was fortunate enough, with the general's kind blessing, to lead our troops into battle. And at Yorktown, I was in fact a field commander, and I have always been proud of that. In the years to come, I would attend school and become a lawyer, and that was my prime occupation. I was, however, the Secretary of the Treasury, and that becomes consequential because of my basic philosophy. I have always believed that there must be a strong central government. We must ignore the concept of states, each individual state trying to represent itself as a separate enterprise. That will not work well in this country at all. And I say to you that those who want that, and there are some here who insist that states should remain absolutely free from the restraints of federal government, but we then cannot have the kind of strong federal government that I say we need. We must have the ability to raise taxes so that we can support those things that a federal government can do. We must have an interrelationship with other countries of the world. Now, what I mean by that is, right now we are a farming nation. A nation of farmers cannot fare well against a country such as England because they are industrializing. And we must industrialize, and we shall industrialize. Right now, people are on the farm, women are spinning, children are sitting around doing nothing. I say that women and children should be in the factories of this country, earning, bringing goods forward so that we can sell them worldwide and have an income stream that we can be proud of and thus improve this country. We need a central bank so that we can finance the kind of industrialism that this country absolutely, definitely needs. I'm a Federalist. I have published papers on that subject. And my philosophy is strong central government. I understand, and I fought hard and well during the Revolutionary War to defeat the King of England. But I cannot now look at France, who may have been our ally then, as our ally today. It is a womanish country, and they will do us in. They will destroy the kind of things that this country stands for. So I say we must put ourselves together, enter into an agreement with England, and promote the kind of industrialism that England has taught us and shown us the way. Even today, when you go to the outskirts of our country, in the Northwest, there are English forts existing today They haven't left. I have proposed a treaty that will get the British out of our country so that we, Americans, not Virginians, not Pennsylvanians, but Americans, can stand tall. It is very, very important, in my opinion, that we focus on the federal and not on the state government. I do not want to take a great deal of your time. The President is here, and I know he wants to speak to you, but I do intend to participate in this debate tonight and share what I can with you. I see the candle is burning low. Time is going on. I have an appointment in Weehawken, that's on the Jersey side of the Hudson, with Aaron Burr. They say he couldn't hit the broadside of a barn if he was inside of it, but we'll soon find out. Thank you very much.
I know I speak for everyone in the audience when I say that we're all eager to hear more about the circumstances of Alexander Hamilton's birth. So we'll go next to Scott Reed as James Madison, 4th President of the United States.
The passage of time.
You will have to use the microphone for the recording.
That is precisely what I'm trying to say, because the passage of time has made the words we wrote more important than the volume with which they are conveyed. I am James Madison. I was always a quiet person, but somehow what I wrote and what I said seemed to have had some impact. I was born in 1751 on a plantation in Virginia to a prosperous farmer, and I never really left the farm. The farm supported me in all of the activities that I went on with. I was the oldest son. Primogeniture allowed me to take charge of the place, and my heart never really left it. I was like my dear friend, Mr. Jefferson. We were from that area, and we stayed with that area to the very end. I ended up a little more prosperous than him because I didn't build many houses. I was a graduate of Princeton University, the class of 1771, probably my finest achievement. But it was not all downhill from then on. I became one of those involved in the effort to free our 13 colonies from the domineering British Empire. I signed the Declaration of Independence along with the one that my good friend Mr. Jefferson had written, along with others. And I served in the Continental Congress. And then I served, after we were successful in a war, in the Congress under the Articles of Confederation. And it soon became apparent that what we had done with the Articles of Confederation really wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to make a unified country, and it wasn't going to do what we needed to do. We had survived the war with Great Britain, but I, along with many of my colleagues, realized that Great Britain was our permanent enemy, and that we did not want anything more to do with them. We had to unify our country. We had to put something together. And so we ended up misleading the public by going to Philadelphia to fix up the Articles of Confederation. It was general agreement there was a need for repair. We got there, closed the doors, and wrote the United States Constitution. And I would have to say that of all the things that I ever participated in, perhaps that was the proudest. My contributions were, they say, significant. I was an advocate of the Virginia Plan, which provided for the separation of the three powers, the judiciary, the executive, and the congressional, And then we went through the compromise that created the Senate and the House of Representatives. All of this was done in a closed session. No one was there to report upon us. And I'm not sure that I wouldn't commend that to all as a better way to do things. After the Constitution was written, why then we came out and said, here we have this. And the public said, you have what? We didn't ask for that. We wanted you to tinker a little bit. And what you've done is scrap what we fought about and come forth with this. Well, we had to create an argument. And so we did. And we came up with the Federalist Papers. They were written by, I wrote 29 of them. Mr. Hamilton wrote a very significant number of them, contributed very ably before his mind warped a little bit. He was very able, very competent. John Jay got his name in there, and I don't think anybody much remembers what John Jay did. Nice person, but he didn't really contribute significantly. But we ended up with a document or series of documents on the creation of the Constitution that have served not just our country, but we think perhaps all mankind forever in how to create a government. Because you must remember, we were really, though we were drawing our ideas from everyone, we were writing upon a clean slate. This had not been done before. And so we accomplished it. And we sold it. We had to bargain to do it. Because many people out there said, well, yes, but what about our rights? What about all those things we fought against? Well, we didn't say, oops, we forgot those, because we'd given some thought to that. But we said, all right, if the price is something we'll end up calling a Bill of Rights, we'll go along with it. We out of Virginia had such a document, had created it. I thought the states could do it well enough alone. But the general populace, in particular our enemies out there who were seeking to destroy the Constitution we'd written in every winter, said, no, you must come forth with something. So I got elected to Congress, and I became kind of the focal point for writing the Bill of Rights. I won't tell you I took great credit for writing the whole thing. That's not true at all. There were some 200 proposals that came from all of the states for what should be in the Bill of Rights. We narrowed those down to 19. And then they got further refined until we finally came up with the 10. And I had to tell you that I really didn't think it was a good idea at the time, but it grew upon one. And once we had done it, I thought it was a good thing that we had done it. Well, I served in Congress for 3 terms. One of those years, unfortunately, there seemed to be some kind of pressure in an election contest. My pattern usually, it took 10 days to get from Philadelphia down to where I lived, and I was always happy to stop for a week or so in Monticello and enjoy the good company and the good wine of Mr. Jefferson. But one year, my brother told me that we had some problems down there and that I must go off and vigorously campaign. And so I did. I went down there and I spent 3 days just before the election, and we had to provide a little rum. I mean, it was excruciating, and I detested it because I'm really basically a modest person. If they don't want me, why should I raise my voice? Why should I do those sort of things? Well, thereafter I stepped down, and in came, we had this mixed up business of electing a president. We hadn't clarified that. We had to do that with the 11th Amendment. But we had these contests, and it turned out we had this election in which Mr. Adams ended up being the president. Mr. Jefferson was vice president. It was very close within the Electoral College. And Mr. Adams, who had been a good person and who later became a good person, got taken by Mr. Hamilton's group off. And there was this election in which the wealthy took control and took control of the administration and took largely control of the Congress. I stepped out of it, but it became apparent that we had made a radical turn. We didn't use the term right then, but that's what it was. We made a radical turn in the wrong direction. And of course, once the wealthy got in power, they did things like starting to suppress the rest of us with the alien sedition laws and so forth. Mr. Jefferson and I found some people to do some publicity and make some kind of a counterattack, but they were very rough days. Finally, justice prevailed. The next election came around and people saw the light, as they always do, given time. They make mistakes, but it doesn't last. They saw the light and they returned enough votes, so Mr. Jefferson became president. I became his Secretary of State. He served, as he has told you earlier, honorably and well, and I was his close companion during those periods of time. And then his time came up, and it was my turn, I suppose, to be president. It was a matter of calling. I just had to do it. It wasn't anything I was really seeking. I did no campaigning. It was simply, I was there, and so I became. And I became president. We got caught up in that nasty business with the British. I didn't mind the fact we were going to war with the British. I kept us from going to war with France, but war was not good. I got elected the second term during a wartime thing against a fellow named Clinton. He was governor of New York, DeWitt Clinton. I didn't enjoy the war. I didn't enjoy the administration very much. And no one wrote in ever after that this was the finest commander-in-chief that had ever existed. As a matter of fact, probably most of what you all remember about my term as commander-in-chief was Dolly Madison saving the art when the British came up and burned the White House. My wife Dolly saved us from that. I think I was ill at the time. I was a very frail person all my life. From the very beginning, I was weak and not really strong, and I had a number of afflictions. They were probably not helped by the fact that I kept going to doctors to get cured, and if you went to doctors at that time, well, it didn't really help you a lot. But I survived the doctors. Weak as I was, I survived till I was 85. When I stepped down, I think the good years came. We ended up back in the correspondence. I participated in the correspondence with John Adams. Probably my finest contribution in those years was to end up publishing the notes from the Constitutional Convention, because there really had been no record. It was a secret meeting. We didn't call it secret, but it was a secret meeting. And my notes upon the Constitution then became the definitive source for further study beyond what we had written in the Federalist, so that everyone could see. And I left instructions for Dolly to do that. Well, eventually it all came to an end. Not immediately. Three of us, Mr. Adams, Mr. Jefferson, and I, served on the Board of Trustees, or something equivalent, for the University of Virginia as ex-presidents, something that doesn't happen very often. We were very close, and finally, in his last days, Mr. Jefferson wrote me, and let me read to you what he wrote, because I think it's somewhat significant here. 1826, February, Mr. Jefferson writes, "The friendship that has persisted between us now half a century and the harmony of our political principles and pursuits have been sources of constant happiness through that long period. To myself, you've been a pillar of support through life. Take care of me when dead, and be assured that I shall leave with you my last affections." And I replied, in probably the last letter that he read, "You cannot look back to a long period of our private friendship and political harmony with more effective recollections than I do. If they are a source of pleasure to you, what ought they not be to me?" Mr. Jefferson died, Mr. Adams died. I was left as the sole surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence. And then, with no one else to talk to or write to, I left too.
Mr. Justice Marshall to make his remarks. Let's see if we can't get everybody comfortably seated. There's a chair here, an empty chair here. We're pretty informal. There's a piano stool back here, or a bench that you could, if somebody needs two seats together. And John Jensen, I'm going to ask you to do me a big favor, if you would. Just keep an eye on things, and if we get some more people who come in late, I'm sure Lanny would set up some more chairs for us. But if you want to take just a minute before we go on, we're going to be at this for another hour. This is a perfect time to run and grab a chair and move it somewhere if you'd like. Want everybody to be comfortable. I thought those fellows right there were headed toward the piano school. I was going to tell them not to play. All right, is everybody set? Good. We'll introduce as our last speaker before we return to President Jefferson, Jeff Jeske as Chief Justice John Marshall.
Good evening, my fellow citizens
And countrymen.
I am probably best known as the Supreme Court Justice, and since my best work has been sitting at the bench, I will indulge myself to sit this evening. I was born 1755, oldest of 15 children, and was homeschooled, except when 14 I attended the same school that Mr. Washington and my father did, along with my friend Mr. Monroe. At about 18, I enlisted. Actually, I am credited with starting what is called the Green Shirts. People today perhaps are more familiar with the phrase Minutemen. In those days, we had a homemade green shirt with white letters stenciled across our chests that said, "Give me liberty." Our first action was in Suffolk. We were sent to guard a powder magazine and from Lord Dunmore, who was the governor of Virginia. And the Battle of the Great Bridge took place. After that, I was commissioned in the service under Mr. Washington, under my father and my grandfather and several uncles who were also colonels, majors, generals in this fight. When my troops enlistment was up in 1777 thereabouts, I returned back to my native Virginia, Fauquier County actually, and pursued my studies to gain my law degree. However, I soon tired of tarrying about and set out on foot to Philadelphia to re-enlist and fight some more, only again to be sent back to wait on the enlistment of troops. At that point, I resigned my commission and took up the private practice of law. I was elected into the state legislature from 1782 to roughly 1788, and I was a very active member in the Virginia Assembly. About this time, I moved to Richmond, Virginia, and the chief happiness of my life at this point was my marriage to Mary Willis Ambler, and we lived quite happily for in excess of 50 years. Now, I have been assailed by Mr. Jefferson and others like him as being a rather hard-tempered man, shall we say, void of passion that Mr. Jefferson speaks of so highly. But I suggest to you that is a very erroneous statement. Those who knew me in Richmond knew well that my wife was of a very sensible nature and was of a nervous disorder. I very happily walked barefoot around the house, oiling the hinges on the outhouse doors, and the house as well, so that no noise would disturb her. And on one particular occasion, I was most happy to see that the authorities of the city of Richmond muffled the town clock and the town bell so that she would not be disturbed. Nothing can be farther from that truth. The biggest single thing that I really wish to comment here tonight is that over this perhaps 160 plus years, a debauchery aimed at me has been left unattended. And there are two facets to what I shall speak to. And that is, of course, the celebrated case of Marbury versus Madison and the allegations of some midnight appointment of judges by Mr. Adams as he was going out of office. It is true that Mr. Adams appointed me to Secretary of State around the 1st of January, 1801. And it is also true that on January 31st, I was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The court records will clearly show that I was sworn in and took my place at the court on the 4th of February, 1801. The events in question occurred on March the 3rd. Now, it is true that I had been asked by Mr. Adams to act in the capacity of Secretary of State until a replacement could be found, to which I did, but not in an active manner. And to dispel the rumors, I was not in the White House at midnight, furiously stamping papers and sending off midnight appointments. A case in point is, as Mr. Jefferson is well aware from his own documents, it is his understanding that these appointments occurred only until 9 o'clock of that night. And not any place, to my knowledge, does he assail me. Rather, he assails Mr. Adams, excuse me. On top of that, it was the next day that Mr. Jefferson sought specifically me to administer the oath of office as president, third president of the United States of America. And at that time, he also requested that I act as Secretary of State for one more day while Mr. Madison could come to town and take his station. I think the facts, as I relate them, quite easily dispel the myth, the rumor, the lie that I, John Marshall, should engage while sitting as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in such a folly to be allowed or to actually be involved in such a deceitful little political scam that would provide nothing for me. I believed very strongly with Mr. Hamilton as well that we needed a strong central government. My experience with General Washington through the winter at Valley Forge proves that then and now and forever a confederacy will never work. If a country is to be strong, it must have a central bank, a central power. The Confederacy, Mr. Hamilton, will never work, nor will a loose confederation of states, something akin to Mr. Jefferson's views, work. I correctly assessed the situation in the legislature while the Jay's Treaty was being hotly debated, that we have come to a real decision between democracy or despotism. There is nothing in between. It is one or the other. Now, it is true that my sentiments lie rather expressly with the Federalist Party, and during my tenure in the legislature, as well as the United States House of Representatives, I was more of a partisan towards those lines. However, once I became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, I abstained from voting, all voting, any voting, for a period of at least 20 years, to ensure myself, as well as to the new country, that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court sits in a very, very unique position within this republic form of government that the good citizens have chosen. There are three branches to the government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. I liken this to the analogy of a three-legged stool. Take one leg out, and there's no balance. I submit to you that the judiciary is that third leg, that balance, that constantly is on guard to protect the citizenry from the factional politics of the legislative body, from the possible usurpation or despotism of the executive. Many of these sorts of things happen in my day, and I understand you have had your share recently as well. The other part of the Marbury versus Madison issue, of course, as I decided that, it was based on the merits of the Constitution. The words, the intent. I have said then, and I shall repeat now, a strict constructionist or a liberal constructionist theories of the Constitution are erroneous. The Constitution is the Constitution. The words mean what they mean. The intent is what it means. It is, quite literally, the job of the Supreme Court to draw a dividing line, however a wavering, fuzzy line, a line must be drawn, and that is the function of the Supreme Court. And in that endeavor, I tried exactly to do that, within the Constitution, not through some extrajudicial powers. And in such a way, I am told by others that I very brilliantly set a bed, a spot for the judicial to lay in this great country. I believe that is correct. I have been said that I am long to listen and short to speak, that my discernment to the facts of the matter were known far and wide. As such, I have nothing much left to say, since quite a bit of hot air has been expended already by my esteemed colleagues. The issues were never brought by me. That is, I never expounded the issues. They were brought to me for adjudication, and therein lies my strength. And I am a modest man. However, I have read from other historians.
Justice Marshall, your appointment to the Supreme Court was for life, but we have less time than that tonight. So I'm going to have to ask you to wrap things up in just about 30 seconds or so.
Mr. Schenck, on my last point. Thank you. That perhaps the real founder of the country is Chief Justice John Marshall, in that he set this division of the three-legged country, republic, form of democracy. And with that, I shall end.
President Jefferson, would you like to make a response?
My dear citizens, I hardly know what to say, so I won't say much. I thought I might relate one anecdote. I came back from 5 years residency in France in late November of 1789. I brought back my daughter Martha with me and her young sister Maria. We actually arrived at the gates of Monticello on the 23rd of December, 1789. I had been gone from my beloved home for more than 7 years. The news of our approach had reached the slave quarters before we arrived. The slaves were given a holiday, and they came down the mountain. Monticello was built on a mountain of about 1,200 feet. They came down the mountain to greet us and waited for several hours while our carriage rolled up. When we reached the mass of slaves, they actually unhitched the horses from our wagon and drew the carriage up by hand to the top of the hill. Then I handed out my 2 daughters. And when I got out of the carriage myself after such an absence, my daughter Martha later reported that the slaves threw themselves at my feet and kissed the ground and kissed my feet and wept and laughed for joy that I had returned at last. Now imagine yourself in my position. On the one hand, I felt gratified to be considered a benevolent and even revered slaveholder. On the other hand, to see another human being grovel beneath my feet was highly unsettling, particularly after my time in France, where all of my friends in the salons, all of my philosophe friends, repeated again and again how perplexing they saw the American institution of slavery. I spent my entire life trying to emancipate the slaves of the United States, never with any success. Upon arrival in this country in 1789, I discovered that General Washington had written me a letter asking me to serve as his Secretary of State in his new administration. This, in fact, was something that I did not wish to do. I had planned to return to France. This was a leave of absence to settle my daughters at home. But there was no saying no to the general. In fact, my dearest friend through life, Mr. Madison, urged me to accept the appointment, said that it was necessary for men of parts, men of character, to attach themselves to the success of the new government. I reluctantly, therefore, agreed. I went off to New York, where the national capital then was, and it was there that I met for the first time Alexander Hamilton. I had heard about him, of course. He had a distinguished war record. And the story I want to tell is of a dinner party at my salon, at my home in New York. I as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury, and my dear Massachusetts friend John Adams, the Vice President of the United States. And there were several others there, but not worth mentioning. When the tablecloth had been removed and the wine was beginning to be passed from person to person, a political discussion began. Now, I am no friend to mixing good food, good wine, and politics, but it was always my habit to be in the spirit of harmony. So this discussion really began to occur between John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, who detested each other. Adams began by saying that the British Constitution would be the best in human history if only some of its corruptions could be reformed, particularly the principle of representation. Mr. Hamilton responded sharply and said, no. If you took the corruptions out of the British Constitution, it wouldn't be worth a nickel. Human beings are passionate, dark, lustful, capricious creatures, unreliable beings. And to know a man's price is to be able to attach him to your enterprise. No, it's the very corruptions of the British Constitution that give it its strength. Well, this troubled me, but I kept quiet. I always respected Dr. Franklin's famous remark that no man has ever been persuaded in an argument. In fact, arguments often lead to men shooting each other, as Mr. Hamilton well knows.
Do I know?
So I maintained my silence, and John Adams went on. John Adams said he was willing to try our experiment in a republic, of course, to see it through, to see what might happen. But he knew that in the long run, people could not probably govern themselves with so loose a form of government, and that probably before long we would recreate a constitutional monarchy of the British variety. In other words, we would take the best of the British system with a constitutionally limited monarch, a House of Lords by way of our Senate, and we would provide more rigor in our constitutional mechanism. Mr. Hamilton said, no, you don't just want a constitutional monarchy. If you can do it, you want a hereditary monarchy. Well, that was too much for me. And so I suggested to the assembled guests at this dinner party that we erect a chair of hereditary mathematics at one of our universities and see how well that does before accepting this notion that virtue can be passed from father to son, particularly in that inbred breed called kings. Well, now there was a pause, and Alexander Hamilton leaned back in his chair and looked up to the walls of my dining room and saw 3 portraits there. And he said, Mr. Jefferson, who are those men? Who's pictured there? This surprised me. But I answered, I said, sir, those are portraits of the 3 greatest men who ever lived. John Locke, whose second treatise on government gave us a recipe for our own revolution, the view that we have rights by nature of birth. Isaac Newton, the greatest man who ever lived in science, who reduced all phenomena from the moons of Jupiter to the merest feather to one breathtakingly simple formula. A man who told us that the universe is not random or mysterious, but a universe that operates like a clock on natural law principles. And finally, Francis Bacon, the English jurist and the man who invented the scientific method. These, I said, are my trinity of intellectual heroes, the 3 greatest men who ever lived. Mr. Hamilton scoffed. He said, no, Julius Caesar was the greatest man who ever lived. Julius Caesar, the man who destroyed 1 million Frenchmen, the man who destroyed the Roman Republic, the first dictator of Rome, is Mr. Hamilton's hero. Do not be taken in by Mr. Hamilton's sweet words about strong central government. He did not give you a summary of his speech at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia on the 18th of June, 1787. I was not there, but thanks to Mr. Madison's very impressive notes on the occasion, I know precisely what Mr. Hamilton argued for. He said, "This is the America I want. Constitutional monarchy, if possible, hereditary monarchy." He said the Senate should consist of men who serve for life. Governors of individual states should be appointed by the national government. The national government, he said, should have veto power over every act of every state legislature. He said, let us reduce the states to, quote, mere administrative units. He called you, the people, the rabble, the beast, and said, at no time in history have you shown enough good sense to govern yourselves. This is Hamilton's vision. Candor would have made you admit it. At least I can say of Mr. Adams that although he had a certain skepticism about the possibility of self-government, he was willing to try it. And when he had a chance to fight a popular war against France in 1798, he did the statesmanlike thing and resisted Mr. Hamilton's dogs of war and kept the nation at a critical time at peace. And for that, he should be remembered not, as he says, as one of the American presidents who are great, but as a man who did something great in the midst of a very unfortunate presidency. I don't know what to say about Justice Marshall. My principle, as I told you, is harmony. We are cousins, in fact. But I called him that gloomy malignity. And let me tell you why. He was appointed in the last hours of John Adams' administration. He admits that. William Marbury, the discredited office seeker, sued for a writ of mandamus to be given his commission. Marshall took the case, and in February of 1803, he delivered perhaps the momentous decision in the history of the judiciary of the United States. He said that it was the province of the Supreme Court of the United States to decide what is and what is not constitutional. That's the notion called judicial review. It's a commonplace in your jurisprudence in your time. But the fact is, and Mr. Madison will back me up, that the men who met in Philadelphia in 1787 to produce your Constitution did not give to the judiciary the power of judicial review. In other words, John Marshall traveled out of the case in 1803 and imposed on our national Constitution its least democratic feature, the notion that 9 unelected, unaccountable, and unimpeachable beings can sit in splendid isolation and decide what is and what is not law in your time for 260 million sovereign human beings. This is unacceptable. Mr. Madison would not have permitted it in Philadelphia, and for you to have imposed it upon the United States Constitution is a violation of the most sacred principle that the people shall govern themselves by way of social contract. And if we wish to change that social contract, it must come from amendment, not from one strong-minded justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Then in 1807, during the Burr trial, when Burr was clearly, after killing poor Mr. Hamilton, was guilty of treason against the United States, here's John Marshall, who read the Constitution as broadly and wildly as he could throughout his 35 years on the court, and now for the only time in his career, he read the Constitution narrowly. He read the treason clause so narrowly that a man who was obviously guilty was acquitted. That, I think, is a sign not just of anti-democratic tendencies, but of genuine corruption. You probably know that during the treason trial of Burr, John Marshall dined with him in Richmond from night to night during the course of that procedure and found nothing of conflict in that conviviality with the butcher of Hamilton and the Napoleon of the American Southwest. Let me turn finally to the one man on this panel for whom I have unlimited affection. James Madison was so shy when he stood before you tonight that you would hardly believe that he's a great man. The fact is that he's a great man in three ways. First, he wrote your Constitution more or less, the greatest document in the history of human liberty. Secondly, when the Constitution did not win popular support, he added the Bill of Rights. You would not have a Bill of Rights if it hadn't been for this man. And imagine the history of this country without the 10 amendments which Mr. Madison offered in the first Congress of the United States. And finally, during his war, the War of 1812, Mr. Madison was the only president in your long history who, in prosecuting a difficult war at a time of national emergency, did not once violate any one of the first 10 amendments of the Constitution of the United States. That can't be said of me. That can't be said of any other president in American history. He's the greatest civil libertarian in the history of human freedom, and he deserves your unlimited respect. And I wish you were less shy, sir, than in fact you are. I must return for one more moment to my dear friend, Mr. Adams. We quarreled in midlife. He took it personally when I replaced him as President of the United States. I thought that was unnecessary. In fact, he left Washington at 4 a.m. on the morning of my inauguration to avoid seeing me installed in his seat. He wrote a letter to one of his sons on that occasion and said, "If I, John Adams, had to return to live my life over again, I would not be a statesman next time, but a shoemaker." But John Adams was nothing if not a man of candor and of generosity. In 1811, our mutual friend Dr. Rush decided that it would be a terrible mistake if the two Argonauts, as he called us, of the Revolution died unreconciled. And so Dr. Rush wrote a letter to each one of us saying that the other one was eager for a reconciliation. Vanity being what it is, John Adams began on the 1st of January 1812 by writing me a letter. We thereafter exchanged almost 200 letters. Some historians have called that the richest correspondence in your history. And then, as you know, we died on the same day, the 4th of July, 1826. I think I can summarize John Adams' character best by quoting Dr. Franklin. Dr. Franklin once said, "Always a good man, occasionally a great man, not infrequently altogether out of his senses." I think we now invite questions.
Tony, if it isn't going to disturb you, I think I will stand up, and I can see the audience a little better that way and act more like a moderator. Is that all right?
They also said if they would stand, they can't see them in the back.
I think that is going to be we will try, in deference to those of you in the back, to ask each of our 5 distinguished panelists, as you bring your questions forward, to stand to answer them. And what I'd like you to do, raise your hands, I'll recognize someone. I guess for the purposes of our tape, I'll try to briefly repeat the question. You can direct your questions to any one of our 5 distinguished panelists, or toss them open for discussion. And certainly I would invite the panelists, whether or not a question is directed to you, to feel free to comment within the bounds of the civility that President Jefferson spoke of earlier. So, questions? A question from anyone? Yes, sir.
Had Aaron Burr fired the fatal shot, say, a few years earlier, would we have term limits today?
I'll repeat that question. If Aaron Burr had killed Alexander Hamilton a few years earlier, would we have term limits today?
It certainly would have limited my term,
And whoever wants to respond, please stand and use your microphone.
Well, I could just say one word about this. Term limits have nothing to do with Alexander Hamilton. When Mr. Madison decided that it was inevitable and right to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, he consulted me. We constantly tested ideas against each other through a long number of decades of collaboration. And I suggested that one of the Bill of Rights be a prohibition on any national officer serving more than 2 terms. 1 term, if possible, for the president, say 7 years, 2 terms if necessary. And I even suggested that we have some way of limiting the terms of Supreme Court justices. I don't know if you've ever thought about the concept of life tenure. It's a very problematic one because virtually everyone who is appointed for life loses either his physical or his mental acuity before he passes from the scene. This creates a crisis on the court from time to time. And as I said, of life-tenured beings, few die and none resign. Of Mr. Hamilton's lamentable death, I can only say this. This is the story I heard. Perhaps you can confirm or deny it. But it was often the case in my lifetime that duelists decided not actually to harm each other. They met because honor required them to do so, and then they deliberately fired their pistols harmlessly into the air. In this way, they can say that they have met on the field of honor without damaging each other. And I think Mr. Hamilton, well, I know Mr. Hamilton wrote in advance that he planned to throw away his fire and not to shoot at Burr. In the end, Burr, a man of no character, showed no such scruple, fired at point blank and shot Mr. Hamilton in the abdomen. 30 agonizing hours later, Mr. Hamilton died. Perhaps you could confirm that you did in fact throw away your fire.
That is absolutely true. I was a gentleman to the end, and I would share this with you. Yes, why, certainly. We didn't use microphones in those days.
Did you have the pistol with you when you went to the duel? Is that something you forgot?
Oh, no.
All right.
I brought the pistol with me, and I did, in fact, as the President told you, fire it in the air, as was the custom. It was, the gauntlet was thrown down, I picked it up, and I did what must be done. The only problem is that Mr. Burr did not participate and shot me well. I think it was proof that he was not a gentleman because the matter was a petty little squabble in any event, and it never should have happened. But he was a mean cur, and I guess he followed different rules than did I, but that is correct. I fired in the air, as was the custom. I think I should mention, however, because the gentleman asked a question about term limits, actually I proposed that General Washington, when becoming the first president, be president for life. That was not warmly received, but I did actually create the original term limits bill. It was just a very long term.
As for the 30 hours on Mr. Hamilton's death, that's very unfortunate for him to go through, but I'm sure it was nothing compared to the more than 30 years of agonizing pain that we all had to suffer with him.
Before this degenerates anymore, let's take another question. Judy?
In view of the discussions that went on about the Constitution, what would your opinion be on the government that we have today in 1996?
And I'll try to repeat that question. In view of the discussions that went on in their time about the Constitution, gentlemen, what would your opinion be of our government today?
Well, I think it's most appropriate that Mr. Madison speak to this. My favorite principle was that the earth belongs to the living and not to the dead. It would therefore be inappropriate for me to speak, but here's the author of the document itself.
Probably the most remarkable thing I could really say about that is that the Constitution that we wrote then, we still have. And to think that 200 plus years ago, people sitting together, exchanging the thoughts of the brilliant minds, but actually putting them down and implementing them and putting them into a written document. It survives 200 years plus later, survives an economy that has gone from 97% agriculture to 2% agriculture, survives in a situation where we have now instant communication. In those days, it took a month to get back where you were. In those days, it took 3 years to get Lewis and Clark over and across and back again. And now it's instantaneously occurred. The stresses and strains that are upon us are part of the society in which we live. But we still have that Constitution in its fundamental form. And like it or not, we are still surviving as a republic and as a democracy under that Constitution. I think it speaks well for what we did then, and it speaks well for what our people have done since then.
Well, never having really been one to back down from adversity, unlike my good friend Mr. Jefferson. I would have to say, in speaking to the incident that Mr. Jefferson talked about between myself and Mr. Hamilton, concerning the discussion of where America would lead, I would have to say from my own perspective, even though it has not progressed to the point that I had thought it would with a British-style monarchy, if you look at your government and politics today, it has created in its own way its own aristocracy and its own ruling class. So I hate to be the one that I enjoy saying I told you so. And so, I mean, and that's what we look at. And not that that's necessarily bad. As a matter of fact, that's good, because it's the people who know what's going on then, and they can make the right decisions. But that is what has occurred, is that it has created its own monarchy in its very own and unique way. So I think if that, I hope, answers your question on where I feel.
Dr. Bennett?
If I may, Mr. Schenck, excuse me. As I said, it quite simply boils down to one thing. It is the choice between democracy or despotism. We ratified the Constitution. We had the country. We have the Constitution today. We still have the country.
Dr. Bennett?
I think when the Revolutionary War was fought, the idea that there would be a Republican form of government, the Republican form of government was going to be dependent upon an enlightened citizenry. And I would wonder if each of these gentlemen would speak to what they think an enlightened citizenry is.
The question is that Dr. Bennett supposes that when our republic was formed, it was dependent upon an enlightened, educated citizenry, and he's asking the members of the panel to comment on what they think an enlightened citizenry is.
I think an enlightened citizenry is composed of those land-holding gentlemen who understand what is the best for those who must work for their daily bread. What could be more clear?
Well, now you understand why Alexander Hamilton could not be the President of the United States, and I mean this very sincerely. I mean, if you look at the spectrum here of these contemporaries, who trusted the people and who did not? Who understood the spirit of this society and who did not? Alexander Hamilton was what I would call a natural aristocrat. He was, by his own admission, born in obscurity in the Caribbean. He came here as a young man and rose by sheer force of his talents to become one of the most important men in American history. The only problem was that Alexander Hamilton did not believe in democracy, and he was out of step with the aspirations of the American people. He would have been a superb prime minister of Britain or a Prussian lieutenant, but he was a very poor American, and the American people sensed this, and by 1800 he was a spent force in American political life. In fact, he helped to elect me, strangely enough, by writing one of history's nastiest pamphlets against his own Federalist compatriot, John Adams, helping to divide the Federalist Party and bring that party down in the election of 1800. John Marshall does not believe that the people are capable of governing themselves. He believes that he and, in his time, 5 others, in your time, 8 others, are more wise, more thoughtful, more committed to constitutional law than the people at large. So the most skeptical about American promise is Alexander Hamilton. The second most, but a close runner-up, is John Marshall. John Adams, I think, is the most interesting figure here in some regards, because he was naturally a Calvinist. He was skeptical about the nature of man. He did not believe that humans were good. He knew otherwise. But he was a believer that government cannot be allowed to run away with the rights of man. And so he fought to create a balance between too much government and too little, too much trust in the people and too much trust to the elite. I think that's a principled position. We disagreed, but we disagreed as rational friends, and that's what enabled us to reconcile after those difficult years. And James Madison and I more or less agreed on every policy question. I do think we have a different anthropology. I believe that man is naturally good and in fact is capable of indefinite perfectibility. I doubt that you ascribe to that. I know in the Federalist you said if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So I think your view is a little darker than mine, and you were not ever quite as committed as I was to universal franchise, to states' rights, to widening participation in government and trusting the people altogether. Still, though, we represent the people's end of the spectrum of the Founding Fathers. These two represent the elite end, and John Adams is nicely balanced in the middle. And this is not a historical discussion. This is a live discussion. In your own time, the same questions are being brooded about. Shall we trust people to determine their own destiny? There's been talk about how the Constitution has survived so well, but the fact is, I advocated tearing up the Constitution every 19 years. Mr. Madison was a brilliant man, but he's been dead for 200 years. You shouldn't be living any longer by his system of government. You should create your own to suit your needs and your aspirations as a people. The earth belongs to the living, not to the dead.
I've heard it said by at least two of you on the panel that you served in some official capacity in France. Now, at what time, this is a part of the question, and in what way did your roles affect the roles of the French Revolution and the attitudes of the people who implemented the French Revolution? And secondly, why did it ultimately fail in that it ended up in another dictator?
Let me try to summarize that question real quickly. Two of our panelists served as ambassadors to France. The question that's been posed is how did their service, and I'm going to suppose a little larger question, their service in the American Revolution affect the French Revolution, and why did that revolution ultimately, at least for a time, fail?
Slight historical correction. I was the only one who was a minister to France. John Adams was a distinguished minister to the court of St. James in London, but he was never an official diplomat in France. He did spend some time before the revolution there, however. The reason that the French Revolution failed was that the people moved too far too fast. Not every people is equally capable of self-government in the American model. And I said, when Lafayette and the moderates came to my salon in Paris and they asked me to advise them about the course of the revolution, I said, be cautious. In the first generation, install a British-style constitutional monarchy with certain guarantees of rights, and then educate the people, redistribute property modestly, get rid of the priesthood and the feudal law establishment, and having consolidated the first phase of a conservative revolution, then in 20 or 40 or 100 years you can move to the next phase. But if you try to go too far, too fast into the boisterous sea of liberty, you invite chaos and a dictatorship, which of course is precisely what occurred. So what happens when a revolution begins is that you can't control it, and the people's aspirations had been beaten down for a millennium or more, and when they finally let those passions surface, there was indeed a bloodbath. But I will defend the French Revolution, including the Reign of Terror, when I was specifically asked to denounce it, especially when the terror began to grind up innocent men. I said, rather than that this revolution should have failed, I would have seen half the earth devastated. If there were one Adam and one Eve alive in every nation and alive free, that would be greater than all of the despotisms of history. Don't you agree that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants? That is its natural manure?
Well, I would have to agree, but at the same time, I would also have to counter my good friend Jefferson's remark. And this speaks to the question of human nature. The French Revolution occurred, and then Napoleon comes along. It speaks to the question of power corrupting, and why there need to be controls in government, and why government needs to control people. It has been said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Even Jefferson hints at this, though he will never fully accept it because he's an idealist. I have been called a pessimist, but I'm not. I am a realist. I see people for as they are. And that is the way of things. The French were not ready for their revolution. They did it, and it was successful, but they were not able to hold on to it because they didn't want it badly enough. And because of that, Napoleon was able to come in, and through his charisma and through the corruption that had occurred with the people who were revolting against the government, they allowed Napoleon to take over.
It is without doubt that the president is a Francophile. He loves the French and their ways. I personally am frightened of the French. I want no part of them. They will take their property and distribute it among the peasants, and nobody will have anything. It will be ground up and thrown away. I remind you again, it is the British system. The fact that we have a revolutionary engagement against them is of no great moment, but the British have led the way. They are forthright in proceeding in the industrialization of their nation, and that is what we want. We don't want any of this French business. We want the British system here. The kings worked well there, and we can have something akin to it here. Thank you.
Mr. President, English teachers today have said that, held up the Declaration of Independence that you wrote as a premier example of deductive reasoning. You've also mentioned that John Locke is one of your idols. As we look at the Declaration, it mentions life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and John Locke spoke of life, liberty, and property. Additionally, John Locke, in his second treatise, wrote about a long train of abuses, which is also included in the Declaration. It's been suggested that you plagiarized John Locke. Would you please comment?
Well, first of all, notice when you said Mr. President that John Adams sprang to attention. He's so eager. He always wanted titles of nobility. When he was the officer of the Senate as first vice president, he wasted about 3 weeks of our national business, Mr. Madison can attest to this, by insisting that we adopt titles of nobility. He wanted General Washington to be called His Excellency and the Protectors of the American People, the President of the United States, George Washington. And he had equally pompous titles in mind for himself. And a rancorous debate occurred over this. He said, you can't possibly maintain your liberties if you don't have titles for your highest officers. Well, he wanted one so badly that the wits of Congress finally gave him one. And for the rest of his life, he was known as His Rotundity. So when you say, Mr. President, you're invoking the wrong being. I prefer Citizen Jefferson, Mr. Jefferson, as you like it. The Declaration of Independence was written in 17 days. I was one member of a committee of 3. Dr. Franklin was the senior member. John Adams was 8 years my senior and a much more important member of the revolutionary generation than I, and I was a relative newcomer. Dr. Franklin was too elderly to participate in this business. He agreed to edit and to make some suggestions. And so it really became a question, would John Adams write the Declaration of Independence or would I? And I have to say that John Adams is the one who enabled me to do it. He came to my boarding house on Market Street one day, early in June, and he said, Mr. Jefferson, you must write this declaration. I said, no, I'm younger than you are. I defer to your better sense of the issues. And he said, no, 3 reasons why you must write this declaration. First, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian must be at the head of this business. Secondly, I, John Adams, am disliked and obnoxious. If I write it, it will have no credibility. And third, he said, you write 10 times better than I do. I attempted to disagree, but in the end, he wore me down, and I did, with some reluctance, agree to write this document. Well, then I sat for 17 days in my chambers, and in doing so, I consulted neither book nor pamphlet. I simply wrote out the common sense of the subject, what you would have written on this occasion had you been asked to do it. Now, John Adams did say of me later that I had what he called a peculiar felicity for expression. And that's what I brought, I think, to the Declaration of Independence. The ideas had been brooded about for centuries. They are part of natural law. And natural law is the law written in your heart. every rational being will immediately assent to certain propositions. That's why we said they are self-evident. The major single source for the Declaration of Independence was John Locke's second treatise on government. In it, John Locke says we are born with rights. They're not granted by benevolent governments. And secondly, whenever any government begins to be insensitive to our rights, we have a duty to reclaim those rights, including by way of violence if necessary. John Locke wrote life, liberty, and property. I substituted for that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Two reasons. First, I think property is overrated as a human good. I think it's important, but I am not with Mr. Hamilton in believing there are no conditions under which property should be redistributed. There are, in fact, conditions in which we must modestly redistribute property. So I don't want to set up property as sacrosanct. I know Mr. Madison is squirming at this notion himself. I was the only one of the founding fathers to make this argument. And secondly, if we allowed property to stay in the Declaration of Independence, Southern slaveholders would point to it and say, that guarantees my right to own Negroes. And I didn't want that to occur. Moreover, I wanted an aspiration, a kind of open-ended, optimistic American philosophy that this nation was going to create a minimal government and a minimal foundation of sufficiency in the economy. And then we were going to do what no people on earth had ever done. We were going to define human happiness in our own way, household by farm by household. And this was going to be a nation with a maximum of individual liberty for you to determine who you are, with whom you like to associate, what you wish to worship, what sort of wines or other drinks you wish to imbibe, and how you want to create your own household, unique in history. That was what I had in mind. Later, in his usual system of sour grapes, Adams said, well, he plagiarized the whole thing from Locke. Well, of course I did, because Locke had articulated the natural law of the question. This was not meant to be an original document.
I'd like to ask Mr. Hamilton if he changed his mind about Aaron Burr being able to hit the side of the bar.
I am painfully aware that he is a better shot than I gave him credit for.
Way in the back. Yes, sir.
Mr. Madison, you were a very experienced man, and even though you died a long time ago, I think you're going to live as long as this country will be called the United States. But something puzzles me that why didn't you find some place for the media in the Constitution?
The question is directed to Mr. Madison, President Madison, and it was, why did you not, and correct me if I'm wrong here, sir, why did you not find some place for a mention of the media in the Constitution?
It would seem to me that the media has found its way in the First Amendment, which of course was after the Constitution, if that's the question, and they have more or less dominated the First Amendment, and in my view, perhaps distorted it beyond all reason in what they have done with it. But we created a system of government when we wrote the Constitution, and we were not really concerned about media is a modern word. I have trouble using the word media when I'm trying to be in the 18th century. We had a lot of frenetic journals that wrote scurrilous and good things, but there were worlds of pieces of paper floating around, but there wasn't the sort of thing that came to pass at a later time. We created the institution. We weren't particularly concerned about who said what about it. We assumed that within our process of democracy and within the process of exchange of ideas, that these ideas would be sorted out and spread about, and that the method of communication would be adequate for the need. And I think it probably has continued to be adequate for the need and perhaps superfluous for the need, but we did not put media as such within it. We were rather to the contrary, as I mentioned, we did not want any of those journalists sitting in upon our halls at the time we wrote those good words.
If I could add something to that, I think at that point in time as well, the media, if we shall use that term, treated us then as they do the politicians now. And so in our own self-interest, we would have never allowed such a thing to occur.
Yes, sir.
Speaking about media, Mr. Adams, did you not, as a college student, get together with some friends and start a paper which in fact began to speak out against the injustices of Great Britain? And in fact, didn't the media play an important part in swaying the opinion of the Americans at that time against the British?
The question, and it's directed to President Adams, is whether or not he, as a college student, started a publication, printed publication, that had an effect on the course of the war and on public opinion in Britain. Is that correct?
With college friends, I'm not sure if he was in college at the time, but about 30 years before that trip.
All right, close enough then. Mr. President?
Well, that is true. But at the same time, it's said that he who wins the war writes the history. And so I'm sure Britain would say pretty much the same things that I have said about my detractors who used the press. They would have said the same thing about myself and my cohorts. But in the true sense of the word, in the sense of the word media as it is now, it's a very different thing. A group of people getting together and writing pieces of paper about how they feel is something completely different than getting involved and showing up to congressional meetings and reporting on what goes on. There's a very big difference between writing what you feel and reporting as a media, if you take my meaning.
Yes.
Yes, my question is for Mr. Jefferson. I noticed that you told the story of the dinner party in which Hamilton allegedly said that Julius Caesar was the greatest man who ever lived. And I know that you're very fond of that story for obvious reasons. It's great propaganda. But is it not true that the only evidence we have for that story is a letter that you wrote 20 years after the fact? And in fact, we find no reference to it in Hamilton's papers. We find no reference to it in Adams' papers. We find no reference anywhere except that you wrote a letter 20 years after the fact. And in fact, if we look at the 40 volumes of Hamilton's papers, and we look at all the references to Julius Caesar, they are uniformly negative. There is not a single positive reference to Caesar, even in his private correspondence. Are we then not to conclude that either A, 20 years after the fact, that your memory was very faulty and that Hamilton did not say what you think he said, or B, that you are so famously humorless that you didn't get the fact that he was making a joke?
I'm not going to attempt to paraphrase all of that. If you wonder at the information that was just presented there, that's Dr. Carl Richard, who's another one of our presenters and part of this series. But in a nutshell, his question to Mr. Jefferson is questioning the authenticity of the story he told about Alexander Hamilton and his high opinion of Julius Caesar.
Well, two things. First of all, it is not necessary to exaggerate Alexander Hamilton's bloodthirstiness. And secondly, a professor speaks. You know, I take it, since you have researched this period, that I also said, state a moral case to a farmer and a professor. The farmer will get it right 10 times out of 10. The professor once or twice.
I rise to a personal privilege. I deny ever saying that.
I could take one more question.
Let me add just one comment, which is that the tie-in between the two is that Julius Caesar had the same reputation with the ladies of Rome that Mr. Hamilton had with the ladies of Philadelphia.
And I do not deny that.
One last question. Yes, ma'am. The question to Mr. Jefferson is why, especially given his views on slavery, did he not free the 200 slaves he personally owned?
This is a grave question. I was a paternalist. I freed only 8 slaves in the course of my life, 3 during my life and 5 at the time of my death. There were 3 categories of slaves in my view. There were unskilled field laborers, the majority. There were craftsmen, carpenters, joiners, wheelwrights, masons, bricklayers, etc. And then there was a select class of mulattoes who were partly black and partly white. These were common on every plantation that I know of in the entire Southern District of America. I never, under any circumstances, would have freed the mass of my slaves who were unskilled field laborers, because I considered them childlike. They were utterly dependent after generations of enslavement. They could not, in my view, live competently on their own. If I did free them, there was nowhere for them to go. No state absorbed them. There was no safety net, no training, no housing, no jobs. They had no rights that any court of law was bound to respect anywhere in the United States. In fact, after 1806, every freed slave was required by law in Virginia to leave the state within 12 months and forever. So that simply wasn't a possibility in my mind. Field laborers were not given wages, but in a sense there was a kind of social compact. I never worked my slaves beyond their capacity. I never asked them to do things that were in a sense out of the usual equation, and when I did, I paid them cash wages. I enabled them to have gardens and small herds of animals to supplement their income, and under certain conditions, if I thought those conditions were right, I allowed slaves simply to walk away from Monticello. When a young man at my plantation fell in love with a young woman at, say, Monroe's or Madison's, I tried to buy her or sell him to keep families together and never to separate them in a cruel fashion. Skilled laborers, carpenters, joiners, wheelwrights, if they had skill enough, might possibly find employment in the outside world, and occasionally I offered these beings freedom. They sometimes took it, more often they would not. When they took it, they sometimes fared well, more often they did not. Mulattoes are another case. You probably know that there were mulattoes at Monticello because my wife Martha's father, John Wales Skelton, had 3 white wives, and when the last of them died, he took up with a Negro woman and produced, by way of miscegenation, a family of mulatto children. So the Hemmings family at Monticello, who came to my household at the death of Martha's father, were in fact half brothers and half sisters of my own wife. And yet they were slaves and she was free. You can see how extraordinarily awkward this is. And if a mulatto was sufficiently white to pass, there were times when I offered freedom to such a person. So that explains my own approach to it. I don't ask you to agree. Slavery is an abomination. It's a violation of everything that I stand for. It's a violation of the Declaration of Independence, and most important, it's a violation of natural law. I think it's honest to say that every person on this stage was an antagonist to the institution of slavery. Chiefly, I must say in candor, Alexander Hamilton, who started an anti-slavery society in New York. He was a pioneer in this field, but John Adams could never understand this institution. When we had those celebrated letters late in life, he never focused on the issue of slavery, even though he knew in some sense that we must, he and I, come to terms with this. Only once did he mention it, and then by way of sympathy for the poor Southerners who were caught, as I said, by holding the wolf by the ears. We could neither hang on nor let go. Mr. Madison and I agree entirely, and John Marshall was a very unhappy slaveholder himself. So all I can tell you is that I felt responsibility to these beings as humans, as in a sense my community, even my extended family. But I would no more have loosed the majority of them into a hostile world than you would your child of 4 or 5 years old. It simply was too complicated for that.
We're going to close this evening. I'm going to ask Thomas Jefferson to step out of character for a moment, and he's going to address you briefly as Dr. Clay Jenkinson.
I've been wanting to take my wig off all day, so I asked for this moment merely for that joy. I just want to say one thing. I'm a professional humanities scholar. I'm the founder of this very idea of scholars taking on these characters, and our notion is you have to do an unscripted monologue followed by an open-ended dialogue with an audience, and then you have to break character and try to explain yourself. And here we have, up here with me, people who are doing this just for the fun of it ad hoc. I mean, in a sense, this is the first performance for each of them. And I've just been extremely impressed by the quality of the scholarship, the wit, the thinking on their feet. It's been a joy. Jefferson is a very odd character. He had an uneasy relationship with each of these men. In some regards, Jefferson was the greatest of them. But if I could choose any other person to be on this stage, it would be Adams, because I think Adams is one of the unsung great characters in American history. For one thing, Adams never had a thought that he didn't express. And Adams was a vain, irascible, petty blowhard who was also a man of extraordinary virtue. And those two things make for a wonderful tension. And when Jefferson writes letters to Adams, they're always bland and smooth and diplomatic. And then Adams just digs in and says earthy, wonderful things back to Jefferson. And in that correspondence, in my view, and that of most historians, Adams, by every measure, gets the better of Jefferson. It's just a great man, and I think much greater than history has shown. They were actually dear friends, and they loved each other very deeply, although each distrusted the other's basic political views. Hamilton, Jefferson said very few nasty things and very few things of extraordinary praise, but he left one of praise for Hamilton. He said, this man is the colossus of the anti-Republican forces. He's a host unto himself. And in Jefferson's mind, if ever there was a pure natural aristocrat, a man of absolute talent, it was Hamilton. He just felt, unfortunately, that Hamilton was a corrupt natural aristocrat. But that hardly matters. That's not really the issue here. And they got along personally. They would walk arm in arm at dinner parties and say, my dear friend and my dear this. It was a time in which gentlemen were able to separate their political squabbling from their personal relations. And then John Marshall, Jefferson and Marshall are cousins. Marshall, I think, has a much more intelligent constitutional theory than Jefferson, and judicial review wasn't talked about at the Constitutional Convention, but in a sense it was being prepared for. Even Jefferson, as a young man, thought that the judiciary should have some powers of judicial review, and he only turned against it when it started to work against his own interests. So Jefferson is not entirely to be trusted on this question, and imagine America if we hadn't had some supreme protector of the Bill of Rights. Imagine if every question of the Bill of Rights was submitted to a plebiscite in the United States in 1996. Which of them would be left except the Second Amendment? And probably then we'd be forced to have guns in our house. Who knows? So Marshall and Jefferson had this uneasy relationship, and both of them behaved very badly in their struggle. And both of them violated their integrity in doing so. But I think in the long run, Marshall has been vindicated on constitutional theory, and Jefferson is seen as an interesting eccentric on this question. But, and I'll just keep this very brief, but the most interesting relationship of all is this one between Jefferson and Madison. Because Jefferson was a bit of a loose cannon, and he was an ideologue, and Jefferson was capable of letting things come out of his mouth that weren't thought through. And Madison, his best friend, never actually in the whole course of his life quarreled with Jefferson. That must have been one of the greatest acts of self-restraint in human history, because Jefferson did lots of things that had to make Madison mad. For example, Jefferson urged North Carolina not to ratify the new Constitution, when Madison had just given the best energies of his whole life to making it. And Madison heard not from Jefferson, but from North Carolina, that the great Jefferson in Paris was saying, don't ratify this thing, it's not finished. Again and again, Jefferson made Madison do his dirty work. Jefferson let Madison take the rap when something turned out badly. Jefferson had no political stamina. He would create some great idea, try it once, and if the legislature balked, then he'd say to Madison, well, if you want to see it through, go ahead. And then Madison, as in the case of the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, worked month after month for 8 years, painstakingly building a coalition and fighting off negative amendments and getting the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty passed. And then the credit immediately came to Jefferson, and Jefferson never even once publicly acknowledged that it was Madison who saw that thing through the difficulties of the legislative process, etc., etc., etc. They're a great collaboration. Madison anchored Jefferson. Jefferson lifted the somewhat gloomy Madison to a more optimistic view of what humans can do. And together they produce, it's sort of, to use a tedious modern analogy, but it's sort of the Lennon and McCartney of American politics. Together they were genius. If Jefferson had not had Madison, I doubt very much that Jefferson would be as well regarded for his legislative accomplishment as he is in history. And the last thing I'll say about that is to return to that very moving letter where Jefferson says, "The friendship which has persisted between us now for 5 decades has never known a single moment of tension." A lie. And then he says, "Take care of me when dead." And this is the greatest act of James Madison. Madison devoted the last generation of the last 20 years of his life to protecting the reputation of Thomas Jefferson against what was happening to it. Jefferson was attached to the nullification doctrine in South Carolina, and he was being ground down by his attachment to the narrowest protection of slavery. And Madison systematically worked for the rest of his life to keep Jefferson from being destroyed by that attachment to nullification and a radical doctrine of states' rights. It's really one of the greatest acts of pure generosity in the history of America. So in a sense, Jefferson was made better by each of these characters. And I certainly have been made better as a scholar tonight by being associated with them. Thanks to all of you.